this next panel session is going to run until about 11:30 UK time, and it's going to look at sustainability. It's entitled Beyond COP26, Com's Role in Fighting Climate Change. Of course, we had the big COP26 conference in November in Glasgow in the UK, and we don't want to let all those learnings just fade away, do we? So we've got some great panelists to discuss these issues over the next few minutes or so. We've got Kerry Thorpe, who's the head of communications for Ben & Jerry's in Europe, the ice cream company. We have Baha Hamadi, who's joining us from Dubai, I believe, who's a board member of the PRCA in MENA region. And we also have Sandeep Dillon rejoining us. Sandeep is from DP World, of course, the head of media relations there for the Europe and Russia regions. And he's already given us a case study on sustainability. So hopefully he can talk a bit more about that in this session. So I'm going to turn to you, Kerry, first of all. And perhaps you could just say a little bit about Ben & Jerry's as a company and how you're specifically working on sustainability issues.
Sure. So Ben & Jerry's was founded over 40 years ago, and we like to think of ourselves as an activist ice cream company. So the way that we approach sustainability, and in particular in this case, climate justice, is in two ways. Firstly, it's using our impact as our business. So using the decisions that we make to do less harm and more good on the planet and its people. And the other part of our business is using our influence. So uniquely, Ben & Jerry's is structured that it has activism managers who work with NGOs and charities to bring people into movements that drive change. So when it comes to climate justice, we work with people like Avaz, people like the Climate Coalition, like 1010, to bring our fan base into movements that drive for policy change that make the planet a healthier place in the future. So it's really a two-pronged approach at Ben & Jerry's, both the impact, decisions we make, and the influence, how we use all of our communications channels to bring people into movements that drive change.
And you've been owned by Unilever for many years, but you're run separately, aren't you?
Yeah, so we've actually been owned by Unilever for longer than we haven't now. But when we were bought kind of back in 2000, there was a unique acquisition agreement put into place, which means that Ben & Jerry's has our own CEO, and we also have an independent board of directors made up of a group of activists, people from NGOs, and that group of people looks after the integrity of our social mission. So that means that we are able to independently use our voice to drive for progressive change. There's a really unique acquisition agreement that we haven't really seen in many other companies.
And Ben & Jerry's has always been keen to talk about social issues and, to a certain extent, sustainability issues. Do you feel you're making progress in these areas still? And tell us a bit about your plans over the next year or so.
Yeah, so I think where Ben & Jerry's starts is not, especially when it comes to talking about climate justice, is not how can we talk about this to further our brand equity, but how can we help the movement to drive progressive change. So our activism managers will partner with NGOs and say to them, not how can you as a charity or NGO further our brand positioning, but how can we as a business further your impact goals and causes. So that's really very, very deliberate that we ask them how we can be of service to them as opposed to the other way around. And I think we have made a lot of progress in bringing people into movements. I think where we want to do better and have increasingly is to make sure that when we're still telling stories around climate justice, we are both telling stories that talk about how terrible things are and how much change is needed immediately, but also stories of hope. So I think we want to make sure that we're bringing a bit of joyful justice into it as well, that we're not just being doom and gloom, but we're also showing that change is possible. And I think also there's a responsibility to all of us to make sure that an intersectional identity is represented. So different groups of people, depending on where they are in different power structures, are affected by climate change differently. whether that's Indigenous populations, people of colour, women. And we know that not all voices are represented within the climate justice movement. And I think as storytellers, we need to be more responsible to make sure that people with lived experiences are put front and centre if they want to be, because otherwise it'll be the same people speaking and it won't be representative of those different power structures. That's definitely something we want to be even more conscious of as we talk about climate justice.
Thank you, Kerry. We'll come on to some of those themes in more depth in a moment. Sandeep, you've just presented, but for people who weren't in that session possibly, would you mind just reminding us of DP World, what it does and how it's doing on sustainability?
Sure, no problem. So what we are responsible for is essentially getting people's favourite goods and products from the factory floor through the shop door, and there are many steps in that kind of supply chain process. We are working to basically make sure every step of that process is as sustainable as it can be. If there are ways in which we can actually reduce the number of movements along the supply chain, we are looking to do that, and we're looking to do that through several ways. There are practical steps that we are taking, such as where we can replacing kind of carbon emission fuels with something which is more sustainable, trying to move as much as we can any kind of transport of goods from off the roads through obviously through barges, ships, but also trains as well, across Europe and across the wider globe. But I think it's also not just about taking steps ourselves. We're kind of really wanting to work with the wider logistics industry and try and lead where we can to kind of ensure a really kind of coordinated effort, because I think as an industry and particularly as an organisation, we recognise that we have done pretty well out of global trade over the past few decades. A lot of it has been a real force for good. A lot of the times we move very important goods. Most recently, things like COVID-19 vaccinations to those who need it. But whilst we've benefited, we've also got a real responsibility to ensure that going forward, we just do things in a more sustainable way, for the greater good. And I think it's a really important thing for us to be a part of, and for us to really lead on and make significant change.
Yeah, it's a very good point, isn't it? In that, you're providing essential services, a logistics company, but equally you're responsible for doing that in a responsible manner. And it's the argument that businesses have to get across to people. Not everyone can be, a perfectly green company. I mean, an airline would be an example of that. But we all see travel in having some benefits to our lives and to society, but it still needs to be done in a more sustainable way. So we've talked about ice cream, we've talked about logistics. Baha, you're coming from a slightly different perspective. I believe most of your background's in the more sort of financial area, but could you just talk about yourself?
Sure. Well, thank you, and it's good to be here. Apart from being a board member at the Public Relations and Communications Association, like you mentioned, the Middle East and North Africa chapter, I'm also a member of the community of ESG practitioners at the World Economic Forum. And as a community of ESG practitioners, our focus is to implement the stakeholder capitalism matrix. So what we do as a group is we meet periodically, and we try to learn and benefit from opportunities and challenges to implement these metrics. So these metrics represent a standard ESG reporting system. And one of the most interesting things I've learned, and I'll share some of these learnings today during the session. One of the most interesting things is that today there isn't a consistent and comprehensive way of ESG reporting. So the ESG reporting system is actually incomplete. And that's a huge obstacle for communications, if you think about it, because it somehow prevents us from being able to validate communications claims or carry out communications genuinely backed by robust reporting. And apart from that, I also serve as a mentor for the Center for Responsible Business, at the Dubai Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And I mainly provide them with communication support for their small business community. I've been working in Dubai for the past 15 years, as you mentioned, helping businesses with their communications, especially the financial sector. But most importantly, I've been using PR as a means to support businesses in communicating their ESG stories. From large enterprises and investors to startups and entrepreneurs, especially over the past 5 years, I would say, I've witnessed how communications and CSR have become one function within organizations, really, and organizations of all sizes. And many entrepreneurs have been focusing on social innovation. Those are social entrepreneurs who are creating businesses with purpose at the core and from the outset. And on the other hand, you have the big companies using PR to communicate their environmental impact in support of the SDGs.
Thank you. So I believe there's not the next COP conference, but the COP after that is going to be based in Dubai, based in the UAE. So that could be a good opportunity for industries in the region to engage with that better.
Definitely, yes. So the UAE government has been recognized actually for their efforts in terms of environmental change, and the government announced most recently that it would reach net zero emissions by 2050. And these efforts have been widely recognized. And as a result, the UAE was selected to host COP28 in 2023.
Fantastic. Okay, let's talk a bit about authenticity, because I do think this is really important when it comes to communications and sustainability. How authentic, I suppose, Kerry, it's about why you're doing sustainability communications, really, isn't it?
Yeah, for us, it certainly is, because I think you need to think about the audience that's engaging with you across your channels, whether that's Instagram, PR, Facebook, however you're communicating. You need to think, what do people really want to hear and what do they expect of us as a company? When it comes to Ben & Jerry's, when we're talking about our impact work, we know that people will want to know, well, actually, can you tell us more about what you're actually doing and where you're falling short? And we know that people kind of will hold Ben & Jerry's to a high regard because of our history in values-led sourcing and all of our values work. So they don't just want us to tell them the good news and all the great things we're doing. They really expect us to stay true to who we are and say, hands up, in this area, we aren't actually doing as well as we want to be, but we're making progress and we'll keep you updated. So we make sure that we every year report on our social environmental responsibility report. It's called the SEER report, and it's on our website. And it doesn't just cover the stuff that we're doing well, it covers the stuff that we need to improve on. So I think on that impact side of things, we don't just need to tell the good stories. I don't think that does anybody favors. I don't think it's authentic as to who we are as a company, and I don't think it's what people want from us. And then on the influence side, so when we're talking about the climate justice movement and trying to mobilize people to take action, then I think it's that we can use all of the tools in Ben & Jerry's communications toolbox to tell this story. So people will expect us to be a bit playful with our campaign names. So for example, we ran a campaign called Save Our Swirled, and the tagline for that was, if it's melted, it's ruined. Taking that ice cream when it's melted is obviously ruined, and if our planet overheats, it's ruined too. And using the kind of playfulness of our language to bring people in, almost like an on-ramp that's a bit more playful and fun, that will then take them up kind of a ladder of engagement and activism. And I think it's okay that we do that, even though it's a super serious topic. I think you can approach it in a way that's engaging and brings people in. And similarly, so I can't say that word, we ran in the UK a climate cabaret with the Climate Coalition, where we had drag queens and poets and musicians tell their story around climate justice in a way that was fun and entertaining, but ultimately drove action. So I think there is a way to be authentic to your tone of voice, both in how you tell the stories of the change that you're making, but also in how you bring people in to drive action. I don't know who said this quote, but our CEO used to say, used to paraphrase somebody else and say, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of the revolution. And it's that idea that to drive change, it doesn't all have to be super depressing. It could be that we have fun along that journey to justice. And that's something that we try to keep in mind at Ben & Jerry's.
Really interesting. But when it comes to authenticity, I mean, obviously, Ben & Jerry's has always had a really good credentials in campaigning on issues that are important to your company. But fundamentally, it's a dairy business. It's quite difficult to be, whiter than white as such. So how do you maintain your authenticity talking about these issues?
I think absolutely. And I think that you could say we're acutely aware that we're a dairy company. And whilst non-dairy is a huge part of our portfolio now, and we have committed as a company to science-based targets. So we've got science-based targets that drive our business and our reductions. We have an internally imposed carbon tax, all detailed on our website. And we have a climate impact page, which shows people very transparently where our emissions come from in our business and how we're trying to reduce them. We also are starting to communicate to people on the efforts we're making within the dairy supply chain to reduce emissions. So I think that's absolutely true. But there is a sense of you cannot wait until you're perfect to stick your head above the parapet and talk about issues that matter to you. The same could be said for our racial justice work in the US. We're a company founded by two white guys, yet we talk about Black Lives Matter and injustice in the criminal justice system in the US and systemic racism. And the two need to go hand in hand. You have to make consistent efforts to prove that you're walking the talk, whilst also not being afraid to wait until you're perfect to talk about the issues that matter to you. So I think it is a delicate balance that you have to be honest and say, we know that we aren't perfect. Here is how we're improving. But this issue isn't going to wait for us. The climate isn't going to wait for businesses to speak until they're perfect, in which case no one would stand up and talk about climate justice because perfection probably won't exist.
No, it's a really important lesson, isn't it? That no company can ever be whiter than white, but that shouldn't mean that you can't take a position that feels right to the people of that organisation on certain things.
No, I don't think so.
Sandeep, you've got slightly different challenges in this area being a logistics company, I guess, but I suppose that they're also similar in that sense.
Yeah, I think for us, I think with authenticity, and I touched on it a little bit earlier in the presentation about kind of wanting to have tangible things to show what we're doing. I think a real big part of what we're doing and our kind of journey of being more sustainable is actually recognizing that we can't actually just do it all ourselves as well. We actually need to really collaborate well with the wider industry and with people who are technically our competitors, but there's actually a greater good here. There's a bigger purpose that we need to achieve. So, for example, actually just today, we were able to announce that we've entered a strategic partnership with something called the Maersk McKinney Moller Centre for Zero Carbon Shipping, and what that is basically is an independent, not-for-profit organisation which is undertaking really intensive R&D to find practical ways to decarbonise the industry. So it's just an example again of us recognising where we do have our shortcomings and our shortfalls, but proactively looking to engage with others to make sure that as an industry we're able to kind of really do our bit, play our part, and make sure we can do everything we can to lessen the impact that we and our operations have had on the globe so far.
Thank you. Aha, what have you learnt about authenticity and communications around sustainability and ESG?
Well, I'll speak from a broader perspective without focusing on one company in particular. I believe the best approach to sustainability is creating and running a business rooted in purpose. This ensures that the business by default will most likely generate a sustainable environmental impact. And not only environmental impact, we're talking about ESG in general here in response to the question from the audience, I think a few minutes ago. And there's a huge potential in this growth with, profit with purpose model for SMEs in particular. And let's not forget that the SME sector in the MENA region, and I think similarly in other parts of the world, the SME sector encompasses 90% of total businesses. SMEs also create 7 out of 10 jobs in emerging markets, and they are responsible for 10 to 40% of all formal employment. So the huge potential in SMEs in creating businesses with purpose from the outset is massive. And whether you are a small business or a large enterprise, I think a sound environmental strategy is not a plan for a year or 2 years or even 5 years. It's a lifelong commitment. True, there has to be short-term objectives and KPIs and measurements and tracking, but KPIs shouldn't be very ambitious because this often means that they're not realistic. For me, the next quarter in ESG reporting should be about the next 25 years rather than the next 3 months. And while it's rewarding to adopt a purpose-driven business model from the outset, it's okay if that doesn't happen, right? I mean, sustainability can be pursued at any stage of the business life cycle. And I'll share a few examples about local startups, as well as global brands with a strong presence in the Middle East and North Africa region, which are increasingly recognizing the importance of net zero policies. And that's because it's becoming clear that unsustainable operations that are widespread today in the business community will have a negative impact on brand perception. And eventually this will hurt the bottom line. So taking my previous employer, Crescent Enterprises, as an example, and through their business incubation unit that they have internally, they've launched a sustainable transport company called ION. And ION was established based on a clear vision of incorporating environmental impact within the economic viability of the business model. So ION has been working on creating a zero emissions transport infrastructure in the MENA region through electric vehicles and charging stations. And that's part of their operations. They're not inventing something new or having a CSR program on the side. Another example, of course, is just earlier this week, we saw the news about global delivery giant UPS using Expo 2020 Dubai as a testing ground for sustainable logistics. On a global scale, Uber has also committed to becoming a zero emission mobility platform by 2040. Didi is another transport company that's also working to reduce carbon emissions. And moving away from mobility, Starbucks Middle East is a good example of how a well-established brand can actually execute a sustainable transformation. Starbucks is now working to become resource positive by 2030. The company has been reducing its carbon emissions and waste, and it's also expanded its plant-based and environmentally friendly menu in the region. And it's shifting to reusable packaging and greener stores. And the Starbucks is not only communicating about its environmental initiatives, it's also encouraging its partners and customers and all other stakeholders to join in on its sustainability journey across its many stores in the region. I think they have 9,000 plus stores. So communicating through the supply chain to customers and partners is also considered communications. We don't have to only rely on the traditional methods. So these are some examples of next generation approaches, if you will, to sustainability and the role of communications in enhancing the brand narrative when it comes to environmental initiatives.
Thank you, Baha. They're really interesting examples, aren't they? It's all sorts of well-known companies and startups embracing this message. But I guess there's skepticism in the among consumers about this, and you've got this danger that even companies who are doing good work and who are well-intentioned can get accused of greenwashing. And Kerry, you talked before about making communications fun and using creativity, which I think is very important in sustainability issues. But how do you avoid accusations of greenwashing at Ben & Jerry's?
Well, I think firstly, it's making sure that you aren't just telling positive stories is one, and making sure you're being honest of where you aren't doing well enough, where you fall short of your commitments. I think also we have issue experts. I don't think anybody would expect me as head of communications to know absolutely everything about every sustainable project that we have going on in the company. So I think as communications professionals, it's difficult when you have a communications function so close to sustainability or the same role, because who is being accountable to the other? I have a team of experts who will be going through everything I say with a fine-tooth comb to say if I'm being too overly encouraging or too overly ambitious or promising too much. So I think it does help to have a business partner who pushes back on comms and who says, actually, no, that's a bit of an overstatement there. We need to be more specific. And then you as a comms professional is saying, well, actually, that's too much in the nitty gritty. How can we make this digestible for our audience? So that tension between sustainability and comms, I think, is really helpful. And we have that at Ben & Jerry's. But I also think there is a bit of confusion within the public with all of these different claims flying around. I think Greta Thunberg famously said, net zero, blah, blah, blah. I think we've got to make sure that when we're sticking a claim on a website or a claim on a pack or whichever, we aren't contributing towards confusion, and that we are doing our best to explain the detail of what's behind the programs that we're promoting, and also really questioning why you're telling that story. Is it to make your brand look better, or is it to educate your audience, or is it to mobilize them? Let's be really clear on that, because the ones that start with making us look better are often the ones that would more easily fall into the greenwashing camp, I think.
That's really good advice to anybody listening, I think. You touched on an extremely important point, which is, I suppose, should comms and sustainability be the same thing? Because there is a natural tension, isn't there? And yet I have seen some companies combine that role, so a director of comms and sustainability, and yet you suggest that that's not ideal. There may be a natural tension between those two things.
Well, I hope if it's under the same director, maybe they have a manager that's responsible for each, or they have an external third party or an NGO who's scrutinizing the work that they put out, not because nobody trusts one another, but because that tension should exist. I think there should be someone saying, we need to give more detail and we need to be absolutely spot on with what we're saying. And there should be a comms person saying, people are going to get lost in all of this jargon. We need to make it simpler. And I think that tension is just really helpful. And there might be some brilliant directors out there who are able to split their mind in two and do both. But I think a third party challenging you is probably a good thing.
Sandeep, where do you stand on this? Is there a fundamental problem with comms people talking about sustainability in that it naturally creates mistrust?
I think this, it's a really interesting topic. And I think just on reflection on what Kerry spoke about there, I think the other interesting aspect is having an honest conversation between the comms people in an organisation and and its kind of environmental team, and having a very clear understanding about what does success actually look like as well. So, for example, for me, if someone within my organisation came to me saying, well, what we expect the outcome of all of this kind of comms to be is, Greta Thunberg being, an open advocate of our organisation, I say absolutely, well, that's never going to happen, and kind of rightly so as well, I think, because we've got lots of work to do. And I don't think we'll ever get to that kind of Greta Thunberg level, whatever that might be. However, I think being realistic and actually maybe having the bar set at something more achievable, such as actually just increasing the awareness amongst our customers of, and also the understanding actually as well, the understanding of why we're doing what we're doing is really, really important, and probably the kind of level that we should be aiming for. Now, I mean, you could argue that that's maybe kind of setting the bar quite low and not being very ambitious, but again, from experience, I think as comms people, it's quite easy for non-comms folk to kind of dress up unachievable objectives as being ambitious. But I think it's quite it's quite a kind of a close line to be drawn there. So I think honest conversations around what is it we're looking to achieve and what does success look like are really important. And I think that then in turn kind of feeds into how you are communicating things. So for us, for example, I think at the end of last year, we were looking ahead to what are we going to talk about this year, just generally what topics are important to us. Within the sustainability sphere, I kind of recognise, well, at the moment, we've only got one thing to talk about at the moment, and that's putting some comms out around COP27, which absolutely, for me, completely smacked of, well, that's definitely tokenism. actually it's a real missed opportunity, because we do have lots of good things happening across all of our business units across the region on a regular basis. And actually kind of sustainability is almost part of our company's BAU, which is actually more authentic and actually quite realistic of what we're doing. So as comms people, it's our responsibility to actually make sure we do kind of reflect that and implement that in our in our kind of our wider comms approach.
Baha, you know, being based in Dubai and having expertise in the UAE region, do you see a risk of greenwashing? I mean, arguably, even the UAE government could be accused of greenwashing, rightly or wrongly. So, how do companies avoid it when they're talking about ESG?
I think what some companies don't realize is that ESG should be an integral part of corporate strategy instead of coming across as companies wanting to merely associate with ESG. ESG should be a natural nexus within companies. If not, it'll sound like greenwashing, like you mentioned, rather than genuine ESG efforts. So I think it's about the strength or the extent to which the link between ESG and corporate policy is strong. I think companies should avoid the SDG bingo, where you hang your hat on as many SDGs as possible just to look good. It might not seem very obvious, but having weak links to the SDGs, as we see in different sustainability reports, or links to any other metrics will make you lose credibility. And I believe today CSR and communications professionals have a responsibility to support consumers, not only in their employers. I think consumers are more and more and gradually factoring in ethical conduct and environmental corporate practices when making purchasing decisions. And we must engage in transparent conversations like this conversation today and really question the integrity of CSR stories out there. And we must, of course, praise those entities or individuals that are consistently turning talk into meaningful action. And of course, CSR must be communicated well. I'm not saying it shouldn't. But what I'm saying is action should prevail over aspirational talk. And that's where authenticity comes in. I think aspirational talk doesn't impede CSR. Recent research has actually shown that CSR is gradually shaped by talk and communication, and that talking is considered action in its own right, also known as talking, by the way. So aspirational talk is key to social change on many different levels, not least the environmental front, but we must always live up to our aspirations. So prioritizing talk over action often leads to customer disengagement somehow, and even cynicism from employees within organizations. So it's not only bad for the environment, it's also bad for business. At the same time, talk backed by action is an opportunity to build brand equity. And if you think about it, many brands are loved for what they offer in terms of experiences, products, and services. And there's a huge potential for increased brand equity, especially here in the region, back to your question, through educating the consumer about the importance of CSR. The problem in our region is that consumer concern about sustainability challenges is pretty limited. There is a certain level of consumer awareness about CSR challenges, true, and I believe consumers do care when they see companies tackling these challenges, especially in times of crisis, but this awareness level may still be limited, especially in our region, but it's slowly evolving. So we've been all talking for years about the CSR challenge and impact. To sum it all up, I think the CSR challenge today is multifaceted. Part of it is the limited awareness about the importance of CSR among consumers, as I mentioned. Part of it is the minimal action by companies as opposed to talk or words. And part of it is the lack of trust among consumers towards brands and their claims. So the role of communications professionals is to educate and build trust genuinely and consistently. And to build trust, I think we need to redefine or change the way we go about showcasing our CSR efforts. Showcasing in this context should mean doing more than talking, and also actively involving customers and partners and the community at large, and reporting on the progress. As I mentioned earlier, we still don't have a unified reporting system on ESG. We should report on our work, of course, to validate it, because just talking about what we're doing means only half the job done.
Okay, Kerry, you were nodding along to this. Do we still use the term CSR in the UK at all?
We don't at Ben & Jerry's. I can't say what everybody else says. I think we don't, because I don't know if we see it differently. I think there used to be a bit of an assumption that CSR would be maybe doing a survey to find out what your audience cares about, finding out that they care about housing, let's say, and then running a campaign on housing because you're trying to get what your audience care about and then running a retrospective campaign. Whereas we always start from what are our company values and what does the movement need? And then we try to use all of the tools that we would use to talk about a product, to talk about an issue of urgency. So I think we think CSR traditionally used to start from a different place. It used to start from what do our consumers care about, and then how we convince them that we're doing something good in that area. And that's not to say that every CSR department is set up wrongly or doesn't have good intentions. It's just not a term that resonates with me or that we use at Ben & Jerry's.
No, it's sort of become superseded by ESG, which is probably to Baha's point, actually, that companies are doing it more authentically and baking it into their strategy now.
As it absolutely should be. And I think there was something that was said earlier, I think Sandeep said it, around tokenism and kind of talking about things when they're popular. So just talking about climate during COP, for example. And I think it's come up a couple of times from both speakers, actually, that there does need to be consistency in our communications, and there does need to be a consistent effort. Otherwise, companies are seen to be jumping in on social topics at moments that make them look good or moments that are popular. And that does nothing to create trust between yourself and your community. I think if you're going to be in this work, you need to be in it for the long term, and you need to be in it consistently. Otherwise, it looks like you're just playing in the space for props from people as opposed to for genuine impact and genuine learning. I think we see that a lot.
Well said.
And if you allow me to make a small comment.
Yeah.
So to your point about, to your point about CSR, and to comment also, and to all those who love jargon, like terms like CSR, ESG, CSV, or creating shared value, corporate citizenship, etc. Like Kerry said, I would say that blindly jumping on what I call the buzzword train is not really a strategy. We all want to have a voice and communicate what we're doing, but having a visionary yet passive CSR rhetoric may actually generate quite the opposite of a positive impact. So I think in CSR, actions should definitely speak louder than words.
It's a good message. We've got a few minutes left, and I did want to try and answer a couple of these questions. So a question from Megan Bredo here. On breaking fast-moving social issue stories, what do the panelists value more, speed or authenticity? And can you really have both?
I would say authenticity. I think brands' response to the Black Lives Matter movement was your classic example. You had brands who'd been supporting communities of colour for a long time, who'd been working with NGOs, who were able to put out a statement that was really informed by people with lived experience and working in partnership with them. And you saw that then their messages really did resonate. Whereas you saw other brands who made very quick Black Lives Matter statements, and you saw people say, hang on a minute, what have you really been doing behind the scenes? Please don't put out a quick statement and not show us the work that you've been doing. So I think you can have speed and authenticity, provided you've been doing the work behind the scenes to be ready to talk. I think if you haven't been doing the work and then you want to talk quickly, it will not end well.
I think I agree. I think absolutely, probably the aspiration is absolutely to be able to do both and do both very well. I think for me, my personal view has always been, I'm always a bit cautious about kind of responding quickly, especially because I think stories can change so quickly as well. Sometimes by the time you're responding, the story's actually moved on, and you might actually look out, kind of out of touch and kind of a bit behind the curve. I think, I think the authenticity bit is probably much more important. And I think, again, part of it is also, I think if you've got an authentic and strong story to tell, even if you are a bit slower in responding, if your story's that good and that kind of genuine and authentic, it should come through anyway. I think there's quality over speed really is the kind of importance for me as well.
I think although speed is everything in today's business world, but authenticity over speed, definitely. And if you can have both, why not? But definitely authenticity above speed.
Thank you, everyone. Finally, then, there's a question really which touches on this area of, we talk about ESG, and obviously the S bit of ESG, sorry, the E bit of ESG is the environment and sustainability, and then you've also got the social side of things, the S. Is there sometimes tension between the two? So I suppose, firstly, Kerry, you Ben and Jerry's talk about both sustainability and social issues. Is there sometimes a tension between them?
No, I don't think so. I think the bulk of our communications is probably on our social issues and on our activism, because on the sustainability side, we're doing the work, and the work is the most important point. And then we talk about, to be honest, we could do better at talking about what we're doing behind the scenes. We rarely talk about being a B Corp, and I think the B Corp movement's fantastic, but we do little to talk about it. I think you'd find that the bulk of our resource and effort goes to our activism work, because that's where the influence of our communications channels really drives change. I think it's more that we don't have enough time and people to tell all the stories. So we've got to be judicious and decide what's worth telling and when, and be really crystal clear on the objective of telling that story and the objective of using our communications channels to talk about that.
Thank you. Baha, there's, some social challenges for companies in the UAE, even if they're sustainable. How do businesses over there deal with that?
Well, I mean, look, if you look back at the UN MDGs from 2000 to 2015, I think there's a lot of talk nowadays about the shortage of action, especially here in the region. And ever since the era of the MDGs, I think there hasn't been any shortage of sweet talk aimed at tackling the world's biggest challenges, whether it's E, the S, or the G. But what was the main result of that era? I think the lack of significant improvement to the state of the world today. So I think there is a huge push today to get companies and governments to do more and talk less. And I think if you fast forward to 2022 today, and during the decade of action, which is the time we're living in right now, for the SDGs from 2015 to 2030, and unfortunately, there's still companies talking more and doing less. But the good news is, I think today's consumers do value companies that are making their mark through CSR deeds over words. So my advice for the communications industry in general would be, for our next CSR endeavor, I think we should consider at least striking a balance between talk and action, and keeping communications very plain and simple. Say what you do and do what you say consistently. I think a genuine approach to CSR is what's needed across all sectors, even the public sector. And this could soon become a strong differentiator, maybe, for many brands globally.
I certainly hope so. Well, we're bang on time, so I just want to thank all my panelists for some fantastic thoughts and some real good insights. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.